Okay guys, I know that Miss Thompson's going to be covering this stuff in class with you over chapter 27, but I thought I'd go ahead and just do a quick review. This will help you to study for your final exam. This chapter, guys, is going to focus on a fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base homeostasis. So in your notes, guys, it talks about body fluid. It's abbreviated with BF. Body fluid is body water plus any dissolved substances that are there. Now, guys, remember that water is the largest component in your body. And then also the dissolved substances. Now, if you'll notice here, it shows you the male and female kind of volumes that we're talking about here. About 55 to 60% of your body consists of fluids. Of those fluids, guys, intracellular fluid is 2/3 of your body water. Okay, and this is the cytoplasm or cytosol of the cell. Make sure that you know that. Also, the extracellular fluid, the ECF, is 1/3, the other third. However, this can be broken down into two areas. You can see that here in this chart. About 20% of this ECF is blood plasma, so that's the fluid in your blood plasma. The other 80% is the interstitial fluid. This is the fluid that's between your cells. Again, make sure that you understand these percentages. There will be some questions. You need to know these fractions and these percentages for your exam. Now, guys, some of the interstitial fluids located in separate areas of the body. This could be your cerebral spinal fluid, synovial fluid, lymph aqueous, vitreous humor, gastric fluid. The list can go on and on. But one thing to understand is that each of these types of body fluids are kept into separate compartments, and they're kept there based on selectively permeable membranes like our cell membranes. Some of these are like the plasma membrane. It separates the ICF from the interstitial fluid. The endothelium separates the interstitial fluid from the blood plasma. Serous membranes separate the serous fluids from the interstitial fluids. And this particular picture that you see on the screen is found on page 1024. It's figure 27.1. Now, guys, it's important to see the fluid balance between compartments, kind of like how it moves and that sort of thing. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next picture here to just show you the compartments. Your body fluids, especially the water, are constantly moving from one compartment to another, but the actual total volume doesn't change so much. So if 10% leaves, 10% should move in. When we look at this, water moves mainly by osmosis. It does this down its concentration gradient, so it's passive, no energy is required, so it's going to move from high to low. This depends on the solute concentration in each fluid compartment. Now, solutes are like your salts, proteins, whatever is dissolved in the actual water. Most solutes in the body fluids are what we call electrolytes. These guys contain ionic bonds. Now, guys, ionic means that they are ions where they have a positive or negative charge. So like sodium has a positive charge, whereas chlorine has a negative charge. So these particular electrolytes mean they have a charge to them. Water balance and electrolyte balance are going to go hand in hand. So guys, when we look at fluid intake, this is your ingested liquids that you get from like food, but it also is going to also be metabolic water. Now, metabolic water is water that's released during metabolism from the dehydration process. When we actually build molecules, water is removed in the process and it creates water for these systems. Stimulus for fluid intake is dehydration. So when we see here with dehydration, there's probably an increase or a decreased intake and an increased output. One way that your body compensates with this is the thirst mechanism, making you thirsty. We also see the renin-angiotensin pathway can stimulate this thirst center in the hypothalamus. We discussed this in the hormone chapter. Dry mouth can also stimulate this center, and then also osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus can detect an increase in osmotic pressure in the blood. Now, an increase in osmotic pressure means there's a decrease in fluid, so they need to increase the water intake. Now, thirst is satisfied when your mouth is wet. Also, when stretch receptors in the stomach and intestines are stretched, and your blood osmotic pressure starts to decrease. Now, fluid output, we also lose water, and we lose water through our kidneys, skin, lungs, and also the GI tract. Fluid output is controlled by a number of hormones. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, causes the kidneys to reabsorb more water. It decreases our output. This is actually the most influential hormone based on these levels of fluid. Aldosterone causes the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium. Well, sodium is going to also cause a reabsorption of water, so a decreased output. And ANP causes the kidneys to reabsorb less water and sodium, so it's actually going to increase output. Remember, ANP is a hormone that's being produced by the heart itself. Fluid intake usually is going to equal fluid output. That's what we should see. However, other factors can change this balance, fluid in versus fluid out. Vomiting and diarrhea, this extra increase of fluid loss to the GI tract can be a problem. Fever, excessive sweating, extensive burns, again, can increase fluid loss, but through the skin. Hyperventilation is going to increase fluid loss through the lungs because you do breathe out some water when you breathe. And then any change in blood pressure can alter the filtration rate of your kidneys, which can cause increase or decrease of water. Now, this picture, guys, is 27.2. It's found on page 1025, and it kind of just shows you what's going on. Also, there's a table 27.1. This one is showing you the factors that influence water, what happens. The thirst center in the hypothalamus, the angiotensin II, aldosterone, atrial natriuretic peptide ANP, and also the antidiuretic hormone. So these are showing you what the mechanism is that stimulates them, but also how it affects the water, which we just talked about. The next thing I want to talk about are electrolytes. Remember, I told you electrolytes are ions. When placed in water, these will like to dissociate. They like to dissolve, but they like to dissolve into cations, which are positively charged. You should probably make sure you know that. And also anions, which are negatively charged. So cations are positive, anions are negative. Now, non-electrolytes can also be in our body fluids. These are compounds with covalent bonds. Remember, covalent bonds is where they share electrons. This would be like your sugars, your fats, and your proteins, so your macromolecules. Now, the concentration of chemicals in the body fluid can be expressed in a number of ways. They can look at the amount of the solute. A lot of times they'll use moles per liter for this. They also can look at the number of ions, and then they can also look at the number of particles themselves. So there's a number of different ways. Now, this picture right here, guys, with the electrolytes, I'm going to come back to in just a second. But let's kind of look at how we can see the three different ways that concentrations are measured. So some examples here, guys. If you look at the sugar, the C6H12O6, when it's put in water, it still stays as the C6H12O6 because it's a covalent molecule. If you'll notice here, it has 5 moles per liter. However, the particles are also 5, when we talk about osmotic moles per liter, so it's the same. But when you look at an electrolyte, like you see here with NaCl, when it's added to water, it splits. It has the Na positive, which is the cation, and the Cl negative, which is the anion. So we start out with 5 moles per liter of sodium chloride, but when it dissociates, it's 5 plus 5, and it gives us the 10. So the number of particles are actually 10, not 5. The same thing we can see here with the calcium chloride. The calcium is a positive 2, which means that's why there's 2 chlorines. Each one is 1 negative. But the 2 chlorines also dissociate. If we start with 5 moles, then we have to count 5 of each of these particles. So that's 5, 10, 15. So we have 15 particles here. So electrolytes, if you'll notice, have a greater effect on the osmolarity than non-electrolytes. And that osmolarity is going to kind of affect the pressures that we see. Now, coming back to the electrolyte chapter, there's a couple of values that you need to know. But before we get to that, let's look at the function of these electrolytes. Many are essential minerals. They're needed for enzymes, like with cofactors. Electrolytes also control osmosis of water between the different compartments. Electrolytes help maintain an acid-base balance, so the pH being acidic versus basic. And electrolytes can also carry electrical currents, so they're super important when we talk about action potentials. So like with your neurons or even your muscle contractions. Now, concentrations of electrolytes in the body fluids are really important. You need to know these numbers, guys. You need to know which ones are present the most. So, in the ECF, the major cation is sodium, and you can see that here in this picture. You'll notice that when we talk about the ECF, right, you're looking here at the interstitial fluid, okay? If you'll notice, it's 145, so it's the highest right there. The major anion is chlorine, so if you come over here to chlorine, the major anion in the blue is the 117, right there. Now, plasma contains many proteins which tend to form anions. These plasma proteins stay in the blood. They don't move to the interstitial fluid. And interstitial fluid only contains a few protein anions. And you can see that also here in the chart. ICF. When we talk about the ICF, the intracellular fluid inside the cells, we see that they contain mostly potassium as their main cation. And you can see it here. See how much larger the amount of potassium is inside the cell. Okay, they also contain protein anions, you can see, or anions you can see here. But the other big one, guys, is hydrogen phosphate. And you can see it again here in the yellow. It's a very large amount. This is your anion that's in the interstitial fluid. Now, in the intracellular fluid. Guys, know these. These are questions on your final exam. It'll have things that'll say something like, what's the major cation of extracellular fluid? Okay, you need to make sure that you know that that's going to be sodium. So you'll need to know these. Now, movement between plasma and interstitial fluid, or both the ECF, occurs across capillary membranes by diffusion. We've already discussed this in previous chapters. At the atrial end of the capillary fluid gets pushed out of the blood. That's the filtration side. But then on the venous side, the fluid gets pulled back into the blood, and that's the reabsorption. Now, some of the filtered fluid moves into the lymphatic circulation, but ultimately it ends up back in the blood. Remember that edema or swelling is an excess of fluid in the interstitial compartment where there's too much, and we got to compensate for that somehow. Now, movement between interstitial fluid and ICF depends on concentrations of sodium and potassium in both of these compartments. So this is why your sodium and potassium pumps that are found on your plasma membranes are key. They also depend on the secretion of a number of hormones we talked about, aldosterone, ADH, and A and P, since these determine the actual levels of sodium and potassium. Now, the next thing that's listed in your notes talks about water intoxication. Now, this is kind of weird to think about, but this causes a person to go into hypovolemic shock. It's a loss of water and sodium. So this could be due to vomiting, excessive vomiting and diarrhea, excessive sweating, but you're losing not only the water but also the sodium. Now, a lot of times when we feel like we get dehydrated and things like that, we replace it with pure water. We just drink water. The problem with this, with the plain water, is it dilutes your interstitial fluid. So now your fluid becomes hypotonic. Now, when a fluid gets hypotonic, water's going to move from outside the cell into the cell, causing the cells to swell. This causes the cells to swell so much where potentially they will burst. Okay, because our cells don't have a cell wall, so they can end up bursting. This causes the total blood volume to decrease, causing the patient to go into shock. It can cause convulsions, coma, and even death. So yes, you can technically die by drinking too much water, but it's not going to be very common. And part of that's because a lot of the water we do drink adds sodium and things like that to the water to help. But this is also why when you're really sick with the whole vomiting, dehydration, or even creating the new formula for like Gatorade because of the excessive sweating, they have electrolytes in them. The main electrolyte there is sodium. Now, in your book, there is a chart starting on page 1032 that talks about all these different electrolyte balances. It's table 27.2. I also included on your in your modules in Canvas a chart that also can give you some of this information as well that you can print off, and it's for your own information. So here you can look at the different electrolytes. It talks about the sodium, the chloride, the potassium, the calcium, the phosphate, and magnesium. Those are the ones discussed in your book, and these are listed here. Alright, so let's kind of switch gears a little bit, because we also talked about how these electrolytes are really important in pH. pH is going to be how acidic or basic a fluid is. Remember, guys, an acid is a substance which dissociates to produce more protons or hydrogen ions in the solution. A weak acid is relatively undissociated, so they only have a few hydrogen ions, but a strong acid has a lot. A base, on the other hand, is a substance which accepts these protons and removes them from the solution. So it's anything that can react to remove those hydrogen protons. So they're going to be more negatively charged to accept the positive proton. Now, homeostasis of pH is maintained by a number of things. The first is the buffer systems, which we'll talk about first. These are really quick fixes. They try to buffer the solution very fast. However, if they can't do it completely, then we also see the lungs will step in. The lungs will help with the exhaling of carbon dioxide. This one's takes a little bit longer to help change the pH, but it still can do it. And then the longest compensation is done by the kidneys, and this is where they can actually secrete extra hydrogen ions. Most buffer systems of the body consist of a weak acid and its base and solution together, so they can adjust very quickly. Together they function to guard against pH changes, and buffers work within a fraction of a second. So again, they're very quick. Alright, so let's look at some of these buffer systems. The first one talked about in your book or in your notes is the protein buffer system. It's the most abundant buffer that you have. Since each amino acid has an amino end and a carboxyl end, they can buffer both acids and bases. Okay, the amino end can react with the hydrogens, so it can bring the pH back up. The carboxyl end can react with the OH negatives, and it can bring the pH down. Hemoglobin is a good buffering protein since it contains many side groups which react with the hydrogens. CO2 from tissue metabolism can diffuse into the red blood cells very easily because of this. It reacts with water to create the carbonic acid that the carbon dioxide can travel in. Also, at these tissues, when the pH changes, the oxygen can't be held on to as easily, so the oxygen gets dropped off at the tissues. The next buffer system is the phosphate buffer system. The phosphates are an important intracellular buffer system. This system acts similarly to the next one we'll talk about, which is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. What it uses, guys, is a dihydrogen phosphate and a monohydrogen phosphate. These are the ions used in this system, and they act as a weak acid. Alright. We also see that the monohydrogen phosphate can act as a weak base. In your book and in the notes, it kind of shows you the framework. But again, the whole point of the buffer is to accept positive ions or to release them based on what needs to happen with the pH. The carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system takes two different substances. One acts as a weak acid, the other as a weak base. And this buffer system depends on a reversible reaction that can go back and forth. The weak acid used here, guys, is carbonic acid, and it is really unstable. It's a really unstable molecule. You should know that for your exam. And it tends to react very quickly. In the tissues, including the kidneys, this reaction goes to the left, where the hydrogen and the bicarbonate are produced. In the lungs, this reaction goes to the right, where the carbon dioxide is breathed off or exhaled. In the blood, when we look at this, the bicarbonate to the carbonic acid is a 20-to-1 ratio. So there should be a lot more of the bicarbonate, the weak base, than there should be the acid. the body will try to maintain a normal pH, and it'll do this with two compensatory mechanisms, and that's your lungs and your kidneys. With the lungs, increased respiration causes more CO2 to be exhaled, so because of that, it increases the blood pH, brings it up. Decreased respiration causes less CO2 to be exhaled, so because of that, it's going to decrease the pH, and this is because of that acid that carbon dioxide creates. So CO2 is the respiratory component of an acid-base balance. In the kidneys, however, we see that there's an increasing the rate of the hydrogen secretion and bicarbonate reabsorption. This increases the pH. On the other hand, decreasing the rate of the hydrogen secretion and the bicarbonate reabsorption decreases the pH. So the bicarbonate is the metabolic component of an acid-base balance. Now these two are both going to be important in a minute when we talk about how the body is going to compensate for changes. In your book, it shows you the mechanism of how this kind of works with acid-base balances. This is found on page 1034, and it is figure 27.7. Now, let's talk about some issues when the acid-base balance gets disrupted. Acidosis is where blood pH is lower than 7.35. Acidosis can depress our central nervous system. Synapses can quit transmitting. In severe acidosis, a patient can become disoriented, go into a coma, and ultimately die. It could be caused by asthma, emphysema, or pneumonia. These are respiratory acidosis because the lungs aren't doing their job. It could also be caused by diabetes, renal dysfunction, ingestion of acidic chemicals, and this is metabolic acidosis, and this is going to be where the kidneys aren't compensating. On the other hand, we have alkalosis. Alkalosis is where the blood pH goes higher than 7.45. Alkalosis causes nerves to fire repeatedly, so they're overexcited. In severe alkalosis, the patient becomes nervous. They can have muscle spasms, convulsions, and then ultimately result in death as well. If it's a respiratory alkalosis, it can be caused by hyperventilation. If it's a metabolic alkalosis, it could be caused by loss of body acid through like vomiting or ingestion of alkaline chemicals. So let's talk about each of these real briefly, and then we're going to do some of these problems. Respiratory acidosis increases CO2, and this causes a decrease in pH. It can be caused by hypoventilation, like because of asthma, emphysema, and pneumonia. You're not breathing properly. The lungs are not getting rid of the CO2 fast enough. Okay, so that carbonic acid starts to build up in the blood. Since the lungs are the problem, the kidney has to try to help compensate. Respiratory alkalosis is a decrease in CO2, which causes an increased pH. This is caused by hyperventilation. The lungs are getting rid of the CO2 too fast. Since the lungs are the problem, the kidney still must compensate. On the other hand, you can look at metabolic acidosis. This is a decrease in the bicarbonate and increases the pH. This is caused by like diabetic ketoacids or renal disease, so it's non-respiratory. The ketoacids use up lots of the blood bicarbonate, or tubules aren't secreting the protons, the hydrogen ions, or reabsorbing bicarbonate properly. So if the kidneys are the problems, then the lungs must help compensate. Metabolic alkalosis is an increased bicarbonate and increased pH. This is caused by non-respiratory loss of acid, like through vomiting or ingesting an alkali type chemical. And the lungs, again, usually help compensate for this. Now, in order to diagnose an acid-base imbalance, we have to look at the pH. And you got to determine if the pH is low, that's acidosis. If it's high, it's alkalosis. You then have to decide which value is messed up. Is it the carbon dioxide value, or is it the bicarbonate value? If the low pH is acidic, it could be caused by high CO2 or low bicarbonate. If it's a high pH or alkaline, it can be caused by a low acid CO2 or a high bicarbonate. All right? If the problem is the CO2, then it's a respiratory issue. If it's a bicarbonate, it's the metabolic. Okay? So we're going to use this little cheat sheet, and let's do some of the examples that are in your notes. Okay? Here in your book, guys, on page 1037, you can see a breakdown of the 4 types of issues when we talk about alkalosis and acidosis. So our first example, guys, the pH is 7.28. So now you have to look, is it high or is it low? Okay, since it's lower than 7.35, this is acidosis. Okay, now let's look at our two levels, CO2 versus bicarbonate. Now, I give you there in the parentheses the normals. So 35 to 45 is the normal for CO2, and you'll notice here that 66 is high. The bicarbonate normal is 22 to 26, and this one's 23, so it's normal. So this is an acidosis, okay, and it's caused by a high CO2, so it's respiratory. So this would be respiratory acidosis. All right, second one, the pH is high, so this is alkalosis. Okay, the CO2 level is low. The bicarbonate level is normal. So in this case, we have an alkalosis, and it's due to a low CO2, so this is respiratory alkalosis. Number 3, again, pH here is low. This is going to be acidosis. CO2 level is normal, but bicarbonate is low. So if bicarbonate is low, this is going to be metabolic acidosis. On the other hand here, 7.59, this is high. CO2 level is normal, but bicarbonate level is high. So in this case, we're going to see metabolic alkalosis. Now on the last one, guys, we have 7.31. 7.31 is still low, so this is acidosis. Okay, the CO2 level is high, but so is the bicarbonate, so both are off. Okay, but since this is an acidosis, guys, look at the bullet that says low pH or acidic. Okay, this one right here, low pH or acidic. Now it can be caused by a high acid or a low bicarb. Well, both of these are high. So since it's a high acid, this is still respiratory acidosis. However, the kidneys, because this number is going high, is trying to compensate and fix it. So remember we talked about how the other system has to try to fix the problem. So in this particular case, they're trying to fix the problem. However, it's not fixed completely, so I would say that this is a partially compensated form. Okay? So these are some examples that are listed there in your notes. Now, when we look at this, you have some of these problems that you can do in for an assignment. There's some more acid-based problems, and there's going to be 15 of them. All right, you're going to submit this to me via Canvas. This is going to be a good way for you to get some extra points. Use this little cheat sheet to help you. Okay? If you have any questions, please let me know.